And Drew's warts and all style of drawing for many years, and I'm very, very happy to see him turn his keen eye on the comic book industry with his new book, Heroes of the Comics. It's also my great honor to be here today on behalf of Comic-Con International to present to Drew our APOD Award for Achievement in Comic Art.
I saw a photograph of this yesterday in one of the catalogs. I said, wow, that's such a great looking award. I'd love to own them. I didn't know I'd have one the next day. That's terrific. Thank you so much. So my name is Drew Friedman, and this is my first Comic-Con. I hope everybody's having a good con, as they say. This is my new book, Heroes of the Comics, and it's debuting at this Comic-Con. It's not out yet. It'll be out in a couple of weeks. But that's, of course, Jack Kirby, the great Jack Kirby on the cover. This is a book of portraits of legends of comic books, guys who started in the world of comic books in the mid-30s and ending in the mid-50s. So guys who began their careers during those first 20 years, those first essential 20 years. So the early pioneers of comics leading up to guys who drew for EC and women who worked in comics as well. Several African Americans are in the book, and there's 85 portraits of people total. I wanted to include more, but I was locked into that number, so I couldn't get Nick Cardy in, which I feel bad about still, and a few others. But basically, it's the cream of the crop of comic book creators I included in this book. And on the cover, of course, Jack Kirby, looking a little solemn because I have mixed feelings about how he might have been treated by the comics industry, but he's possibly the greatest artist who ever worked in comics, the most legendary figure who worked in comics. And this is him a little later in life, maybe a little melancholy. But I thought it was important to include him on the cover as the number one, as the top pick, as far as I'm concerned, of comic book creators. So again, we're waiting for Gary Brock, who's going to, I assume, have some nice questions. But this book is will be available, of course, at Fantagraphics booth. I'll be signing at 17 to 18 their booth from 1 to 3. So if you want to stop by, the books will be there, and I'll be happy to personally inscribe them to you. So why don't we move on to the next image? This, of course, is possibly the most famous man who ever worked in comics. To this day, he's still kicking. I heard he's not here because his voice is not great. But that's Stan Lee, who's 91, I think, this year. And this is a more recent Stan. This is the portrait I did for the book. Stan is always on. He seems to never turn off. I don't know what that is on his head. I've been told they're hair plugs. I know he used to wear a wig, and one of the next images was going to be an earlier Stan with the wig. The thing is, I knew Stan when I was a little kid back in the 60s, because my dad was a magazine editor at Magazine Management, which was the company that owned Marvel. So when I was a little kid, I'd go up to Marvel to visit my dad, and of course I made a beeline for the comic book department at Marvel. And Stan Lee was always present, and as charming as can be. He was paunchy then, he was balding, and he was very tall, but he was just like he was like a favorite uncle. Instead of dispensing candy, he dispensed comic books. So I really loved him. I didn't know him too well, but he was like, the guy who ran the company was Martin Goodman, who ran Marvel, first Atlas, first Timely, then Atlas, then Marvel. He was my dad's boss. Him I never saw. And, but Stan, here comes Gary, who has some Stan Lee stories as well. Stan was always there. I loved him, and Stan wanted me to work for Marvel because he knew I was an artist. He said, someday Drew is going to draw for Marvel. It didn't quite work out that way, but I did work up at Marvel for a week when I was 14 in 1973. And here's the great Gary Brock.
On another panel that was across the convention.
I understand. You need a jazzy. That's what you need.
Yeah.
Jerry Lewis used to have a
I know
jazzy.
that is, but I do want
It's like you sit down and you just like go through, the crowds. You've seen the commercials for jazzies, right?
Of course.
So we're talking about one of your favorite topics, Stan Lee.
Yeah.
So we're showing the image, of course, from the book. I was speculating about what that was on Stan's head. How do you explain that? Those are hair plugs. Would you say at this point?
Yeah.
That's what I've been told. They're hair plugs.
Now I have a very, very specific question about Stan Lee in the book.
Right.
Drew wrote a preface to the book. It's like a 6-page history of his involvement with comics. And one of them involved his being like a 1-week intern at Marvel Comics, thanks to his father, Stan Lee. And you referred to Stan Lee, you know what, I think this was earlier when you were even smaller, you were a kid, right? And you visited the Marvel offices, and you referred to Stan Lee as Pudgy. I never knew Stan Lee was Pudgy. Is that?
Early mid-60s, when I knew him, 63, 64, 65, when I would go up there often, he was pudgy. He was tall, balding, and pudgy. And that's how I would describe him. And we'll cut to the next image of Stan. I brought 3 images of Stan along here. This is the groovy Stan in the early 70s.
Right.
When he kind of re-emerged with his new look, lost weight, grew the mustache. All of a sudden he had a full head of hair somehow. Hair plugs. Yeah. I think this was pre-hair plugs. That was like, somehow that was on. But this is the Stan when I worked up at Marvel in the early 70s. This is the Stan I remember I wanted to capture. This is included in the book in my introduction. I did these pencil sketches for the introduction, leading into the painted full-color paintings in the book. This is the younger, groovier Stan, circa 1972. And
What year did you work at Marvel?
I worked at Marvel late 72 for a week, if you call it work. It was basically like, you know, they sent me out on errands. I picked up Tomb of Dracula cover, I remember that, which was one of their new books. Tony Isabella sent me out for errands. Roy Thomas talked to me. John Romita was very sweet. He kept me busy. I think he said, "Would you trace this image of Fantastic Four for me?" I think he didn't need it. He wanted to keep me busy. He took a liking. Marie Severin was up there. Herb Trimpe, who looked just like Alan Alda. He was up there. I remember that. So that was my week, and they paid me $50. That's awesome. And then Stan sent me a Christmas card. You know, I was in heaven. But I never worked for Marvel again after that. That was it.
Pretty bad when Tony Isabella sent you on errands.
In retrospect, yeah. When I think about it now, but I was honored. Sure, what do you want? Whatever you want, Mr. Isabella. We'll show the next image, which is more Stan, part 3. This was, I think, from 20 years ago, cover of comics. The special Stan Lee issue. Gary assigned me this. I think that was pre-hair plugs. That was toupee. He was still on, popped on his head. This is my liver spots here.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to Stan in the last?
No, I have not in the last 42 years. I haven't spoken to Stan. He was very sweet when I worked up at Marvel. He was thrilled. I talk about working up at Marvel, and my dad took me up to Marvel. Stan said, like, come up with your dad. My dad and Stan always got along when they worked at Magazine Management. They worked side by side with the partition between them, so they knew each other pretty well. They didn't really socialize outside the office. My dad always liked Stan, felt sorry for him when they cut the office down to one desk, Stan's desk, in the mid-50s when they were phasing out the comics. Martin Goodman wanted to phase out the comics because of the comic book witch hunts. They had to fire everybody, and so it was down to Stan and his secretary. I remember my dad feeling bad about that. But everything, re-emerged in the early 60s, of course. But when I knew Stan, I asked I had to do a work-study program at my high school for a week, and I said, what could I do? I said, I get my dad to call. It's handy to have a dad who's like, in the arts or a writer. Have him call Stan and ask if I could work up there. Stan said, sure, but come on up ahead of time. So I can set Drew up with my secretary, and we can work out, what he's going to be working on. So we went up on a Monday, and we sat down with him in his office, and Stan said, this is going to be great. It's going to be great to have Drew Friedman working here for a week. And he looked at my dad and said, and it's going to be great to have Bruce J. Friedman writing the Spider-Man film. My father, he went blank. He had never heard about that. And Stan left the office, he looked at me, and he said, son of a bitch, that's why he's letting you work here. And then a minute went by, and he thought about it, he said, so how did he become Spider-Man? After mulling it over.
Okay, now I have to ask you this, since Stanley's up there. Do you respect everybody in this book on one
No,
level?
no, not at all. We've talked about it. We actually considered calling this book Heroes and Villains of Comics. But in one way or another, even if I don't respect them, they all had a significant role in the history of comics, including Bob Kane and Frederick Wortham, who's in the book, and several people who you might think of as more like villains of the comics. I do have we talked about Stan also, and that era, that brief time in the mid-'60s when he was conceiving those amazing characters with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and Bill Everett. That was pretty impressive.
The best work of his life.
Right. So, even if, the man has had a 70-year career, and even if there's, a couple of years there where he actually created that stuff, or co-created Fantastic Four and X-Men and Spider-Man, I mean, that's enough to qualify him to be in the book, certainly. So this is, of course, Will Eisner, who I had as a teacher back at the School of Visual Arts in the late 70s. This was, we talked about this yesterday, we had a Will Eisner panel, Will Eisner's students. This was an amazing period at the School of Visual Arts in the late 70s, early 80s, when you had Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, and Art Spiegelman all teaching together the same week. So I go back and forth between those three classes. Of course, at the time, it's like you don't think about that. It's like they're just your cartoon teachers. But there were certain students in the class who appreciated the fact that Eisner was a teacher, Kurtzman was a teacher, these legendary guys, where most people in the class, they just thought they were cartoon instructors. They were taking the class for grades and stuff. But Will was he taught sequential art. Very structured course on sequential art. Unlike Harvey, his course was a lot looser and more free-flowing. Will was very structured, and he basically taught comics the Will Eisner way, which is what he knew. So that's what he wanted to pass on. But this is Will. I used to look at Will at the Comic-Cons in the 70s. He was never happier than when he was at a Comic-Con, surrounded by adoring fans.
He won't allow me today either. I thought I had an extensive conversation.
Are you saying he's somewhat strange? He hasn't been photographed. Steve Ditko, I'm not sure we're showing the image, it's in the book, but he hasn't been photographed since 1959. At first I thought about doing these guys' portraits as older people, but I would have had to leave out some guys who died young, like Matt Baker, and MC Gaines actually died fairly young, and a few others like that. So I said, no, I got to expand it to middle-aged, young, and then there's some younger portraits as well. So I didn't really lock into old guys. I kind of did that with the Jewish comedians all over, so I wanted to expand it a bit. So here's Al Jaffe. This is more recent. That's the MAD office building behind him. MAD is actually shutting down and moving to Los Angeles, for what that's worth. So it's not moving in. Oh, that's right. But I think DC wanted MAD to go with them. I know that the guys are staying. So 1,700 books. So that's Al. He wrote the introduction to this book. He did a lovely introduction, and he's an incredibly nice man, a sweet guy. I wanted to capture that twinkle in his eye, which he still has. And he's still contributing. He's the longest contributor MAD ever now, officially. And so I wanted to capture that. He's a very cuddly guy, and I wanted to capture his cuddliness.
I have a general question. I mean, I was a sweet guy. To what extent did you try to aim for objectivity in the fiction you keep looking? How much did you allow your fondness or your...
I was totally biased when he chose it. I love the guy, so I wanted to... I didn't really want that to affect the images. I mean, there's some people I'm not going to mention names. There's some artists who, I'm not crazy about their work, but that didn't affect the image, I just wanted each one to be vivid and as lifelike as possible, no matter what my personal feelings were. But overall, I admire most of the people, just about most. I'd say 85% of the people I included in the book. It's Tucker, who supposedly had the other legendary appendage. They held a contest to see who was larger. So Forrest Tucker and Milton Berle went into the men's room at Hillcrest. A few minutes later, Milton emerged, and someone said to him, "Milton, what happened?" And Milton said, he took his cigar out, and he said, "I only took out enough to win."
Poor Forrest Tucker.
Yeah, he was devastated. But I asked Larry Storch about Forrest Tucker if it was true, and he confirmed it was true. What was the line? Forrest said it was not fair. Milton's all prick.
Gentleman in the hat.
What inspired your unique inking technique, unlike anyone else?
I did this work in watercolor. That's where I wound up. I started with the stipple work, which was black, well, just basically dipping a crow quill pen into ink and tapping away, stippling. But it finally drove my wife insane after listening to that for 10 years, just trying to get to bed. And we lived in a small apartment in the city at the time. And I'd be tapping away. And it drove her insane, so I had to phase that out. So then I started working with the brush, which I was afraid to touch. And I remember when I took Eisner's class, he was amazing with the brush. He would sit down and just like, draw the spirit, the head, within 3 minutes, and he'd have this beautiful like spirit head. It was like, I always like, I never forgot that, like, because I was afraid of the brush. I could never achieve something like that. But taking my time, over the years, it was a process, to where I am now, where I'm comfortable with the brush, and that's basically it. It's a watercolor. I don't use oil paint because I just don't have the patience to wait for it to dry. So I like, the instant, with the watercolor. It's like it just works for me. So.
Right there. Do you still get any fallout from your Nat King Cole cartoon?
No, I got it at the time. I did a drawing of Nat King Cole. Okay, I'll be honest, it was a Nat King. My wife and I actually conceived this for a trade publication in Hollywood about radio and records. I drew during when Natalie Cole had her hit of Unforgettable. So I drew a drawing of Nat King Cole as a skeleton with a toupee on his head, with a cigarette out of his mouth, and Natalie Cole right beside him. They're both singing Unforgettable together. So it's like basically she's like taking his corpse and working with the corpse of that. It's kind of nasty, but I got fired from the publication for putting that drawing, for doing that. It got so much backlash, negative backlash, and I think one record company pulled out their ads and stuff. So this was back when I was more of a wise guy. I kind of like moved on from there, but no more fallout.